us online. And oh, I maybe I started a bit too soon, so I'll start again. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us online for today's conversation with Chang-rae Lee and Bryan Washington. My name is Jeffrey, and I'm the Executive Director of the Asian American Writers Workshop, and we are so excited to welcome you to our online virtual space. For those of you who are new to the workshop, we are a national literary nonprofit dedicated to uplifting and empowering Asian and Asian diasporic literature and storytelling. You can learn more about our offerings on our website at aaww.org. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at AAWW. And you can also watch an archive of all of our events on YouTube, including this one that'll be archived at its conclusion. During the event, we ask that all audience members practice nonviolence in the chat. Comments that are racist, transphobic, homophobic, ableist, and or misogynist will be flagged, and the person will be removed from this event. We do have time for Q&A at the end of the event, so be sure to share your questions using the Q&A function. You can find that at the bottom of your screen. While I'm at it, I encourage everybody to share in the chat where they're from. I know we have people from all over the world, so please do share with us if you're in the Zoom chat to just share with us where you're signing on from. I want to give a couple of quick shout outs to some partners who worked with us on this event. First, to Tables of Contents, who have put together and developed a really amazing looking omelet recipe in honor of today's launch. I encourage all of you to check that out on their Instagram account at Tables of Contents. We'll also include a link in the chat. I also want to thank our friends at Books Are Magic, who are helping us ensure that books are for sale. You can find a link to purchase books also in the chat, and I encourage you to support our authors and independent bookstores today and every day. I'm going to quickly introduce both Chang-rae and Bryan, and then I will head out and I will hand the virtual mic over to them. Chang-rae Lee is the author of Native Speaker, winner of the Hemingway Foundation PEN Award for First Fiction, as well as On Such a Full Sea, A Gesture Life, Aloft, and The Surrendered, winner of the Dayton Peace Prize and a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Chang-rae Lee teaches writing at Stanford University. Bryan Washington is a National Book Award 5 under 35 honoree and winner of the Dylan Thomas Prize and the Ernest J. Gaines Award for Literary Excellence. He received the New York Public Library Young Lions Fiction Award and a Lambda Literary Award for his first book, Lot, which was also a finalist for the NBCC's John Leonard Prize, the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize, and the Aspen Words Literary Prize. His debut novel, Memorial, was named a Book of the Year by the New York Times Book Review, Entertainment Weekly, Time, Vanity Fair, and more. He's written for The New Yorker, The New York Times, BuzzFeed, Bon Appetit, and GQ, among other publications. I want to thank both Chang-rae and Bryan for being here tonight. We are so thrilled and honored to be celebrating Chang-rae's new book. And so with that, I will call Chang-rae Lee to our virtual stage and hand the mic over to him for a quick reading.
Hi, Al. Thanks again for inviting us here. And, Asian American Writers Workshop has been around since my very first book. And I've always felt wonderfully supported and honored by their work and by their interest in all of us writers. And so I want to thank you. It's been, I think, like 25 years or so. So it's been really great. So I thought I'd just start by just reading very briefly, maybe 2 pages from the book, and then Bryan and I can talk. This is the main character of this novel is named Tiller. He's a kid who lives in this town called Dunbar in New Jersey, and he's just this is the scene in which he first meets the other hero of the novel, a guy named Pong Lu, a Chinese businessman. But this is just their accounting, where and how they met. Tiller is a dishwasher at a restaurant in town. I might have worked at the restaurant the rest of the summer had I not last minute subbed one day for an acquaintance of mine at the local country club where he caddied. I knew pretty much nothing about golf except for playing a golf video game once and watching Caddyshack multiple times stoned. But he said it was a member guest tournament and all I had to do was four caddy, which meant positioning myself in the area where people would hit their shots and helping to find errant ones and raking the bunkers and holding the flagstick during the putting. Because the caddy master knew I knew nothing, he put me with a foursome none of the regular caddies wanted. I guess nobody wanted them because the member was a beginning golfer and his shots went all over the place, and because of the assumption that his three guests would be no better. The member was a cardiologist named Patel, a big, strong, chatty lefty who indeed hit his shots long but very wrong, and sometimes dead sideways, and once even backward, an amazing unintended trick shot that he accomplished by just barely undercutting his teed up ball with a ferocious swing, creating such wicked backspin with the top of his metalwood that the ball went almost straight up in the air, landed a few feet in front of him, and then spun back to where the rest of us were standing. Dr. Patel's guests were two of his colleagues, another tall Indian guy and a chubby Jewish lady who was actually quite good as she'd played some high school golf, plus a friend of his named Pong Lu, who was a chemist at one of the big pharmaceutical companies headquartered nearby. And they all broke up like crazy after the shot, with Dr. Patel helicoptering his club into the bordering native grasses and raising his hands in victory. I retrieved it for him, and he let me have one of the cocktails studding the cup holders of his golf cart. The whole day went like that. After the first 9 holes, I was totally beat, running back and forth from the woods that framed every fairway, searching for their tee shots, stepping ankle deep into streams to retrieve dunked ones, and raking the sand after they basically strip mined the bunkers, trying to blast their balls out. The chemist, Pong, was the worst at the beginning, but not by the end. He had never played before, not having even once gone to a driving range or a putt-putt. For the first 6 or so holes, he pretty much whiffed on half of his swings. And then the ones he did strike often didn't fly as far as the massive pelts he'd excavate, these lush, beauteous mini islands of sod. On one green, he needed 7 putts before holing out, putting clear off the green not once but twice. And he almost brained his host when he shanked a fairway wood, the shot whizzing past Patel's ear so closely that the cardiologist swore it nicked his earlobe. Patel laughed about it, but absently massaged it the rest of the round, and then touched his fingers to his lips, as if tasting the haunting liquor of oblivion. But that was Pong's last really awful shot. His swing was certainly funny looking. Imagine a pirate sabering himself free from a knotty mess of rigging. But he began making solid contact, and if they weren't majestic, his shots started landing near the fairways, then near the greens, then sometimes on them, and he suddenly got a feel for the speed and slope of the surfaces, holing a few long putts. He even chipped in. He actually made a legit par on the last hole, which Dr. Patel said was the toughest on the course. As I was loading the group's club onto a golf cart to ferry them to the bag drop area in the parking lot, Pong told me to take his clubs back to the pro shop, as they were rentals. I said he ought to buy his own set now, for how well he was already playing, and he said, no way, joking that his brilliant career was over. I could hardly decipher brilliant career because of his peculiar pronunciation, which I could tell right away was because he was a native Mandarin speaker. I sort of took Mandarin 1 and 2 my first 2 years of college, and the instructor, Miss Wu, had the same way of speaking English, with all those gargly sure and were and to sounds. Anyway, I said some of the final shots he hit were freaking amazing, and he admitted that he'd spent the entire night before studying instructional videos on YouTube on every aspect of the game, including dress and etiquette. But watching a video and playing are totally different things, I said. They are not so far apart if you try to focus on something fundamental, Pong answered. What is that? I asked, curious as to what he'd gleaned. To follow through with fullness, he said, sweeping his hand forward and upward, right up to the sky. This sport is fascinating, but it takes too long to be useful for someone like me. I would prefer if only 9 holes were played, just long enough for enjoying the game and for doing business. There would be more time for camaraderie afterwards as well. We have an eternity for camaraderie now, Dr. Patel announced brightly. Time for some serious drinking, my friends. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, now we're here. Hi, Chang-rae.
Hi, Brian.
Hey there. Quick thanks to everyone that's joining us from all over. Any number of pressing demands right now, and our world's both personal and on a macro level, so it means a good deal that you've taken time to talk about story and My Year Abroad, a really beautiful, luminous novel that I just cannot say enough and that I can't say lightly. But I think the first question that I'd want to ask is that this is the sixth book that you've published, and yet it's the first that you published in the midst of a pandemic. So I'm wondering just how you're doing, just generally, and how has the experience been? Like how this week has been, how the week prior has gone.
Well, normally, on the eve of a book, and the book just came out. I'd be, in a city somewhere, right? Start, ready to start off. Most of my book tours are like 3 weeks straight. Um, Flying from, once I did 23 cities in 21 days, which is really a certain kind of, wonderful torture in a way.
It sounds
great, to,
like it.
great to meet people, great to see all these cities, although you see them very briefly. But the traveling, of course, as is hellish. I once even got like a really bad carpal tunnel syndrome because I was like lifting my bag up into the overhead so much 21 23 times or something, and I thought I actually had gout. I remember calling my publicist saying I think I have gout, because my hands were like paralyzed. But otherwise, I wrote this book and finished editing the book, pretty much before the pandemic, or so the book wasn't affected by the pandemic, but of course, we have, in a lot of tough ways and a lot of decent ways too. So I don't know, maybe like you, I've become kind of an amateur mixologist every day. I never,
Learning something new every day.
I mean, I would never do that. Maybe I'd have wine with dinner, and but somehow it's like, gee, I want to try that new bitters that my friend gave me, and I'm gonna make this kind of, Manhattan, or maybe that other kind of Finnish gin would be good for it, and obviously it's for fun, but also probably because I need to clear my head, or not clear my head.
I think that, I mean, just thinking of the voices in our respective heads as we make our way through all of this, and also the voices within the novel itself. I think that's something that really, because I read the book for the first time last year because I guilt tripped any number of folks at Riverhead into sending me a galley. So I was really thankful for that, and also for the chance to read it early. And the first thing that really jumped out at me, as it has with each of your books, is the voice of Tiller, the voice of Pong, and their respective narrations as they vary over the course of the novel, but also the voices of each of the characters that they come across in the larger world. And reading the book, it feels very much like a book that is about the world, but also a book that is of the world. And so much of that is rooted in what feels just like a symphony of different voices. So I'm wondering how when a voice works for you as far as your general writing is concerned, and how it felt to land on the voice of both Tiller and Pong. Were they voices, and just as far as what they cared about, as far as things like the structures of how they spoke, the respective rhythms, were they things that you knew from the outset, or were they things that revealed themselves to you over the course of many different drafts, and did they perhaps change from what you originally envisioned?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, voice is super important to me. I can't, whether it's first person or third person or plural plural first person, or even the second person sometimes I'll go into. I really can't understand the story unless it's not, and ultimately it's not about character at the start. You know, obviously I get to know the character and fill out him or her, but um, if I don't have a real sense of the kind of, I would just say, music that's coming out of them, I don't feel comfortable enough moving forward. And as you know, writing novels, you have to be pretty committed and at least provisionally confident to start and right, to go into a novel and to think, most importantly, is this a voice I can sustain throughout this novel? It will continue to be, and also most importantly, can it sustain my curiosity and my inquiry and my investigations of it? Because it's not just, for me, someone telling the story, it's the story begins to tell them back, right? It begins to kind of, it's a mirror to them, and it pushes them to maybe, and one hopes, you know, new kinds of language, new kinds of perspectives. You know, you don't want a voice that's absolutely the same throughout. You know, I'm not that talking about a huge change, but I just, these very subtle kind of, you know, mutations, a subtle kind of very subtle evolution of that voice throughout, so that it never bores you, but it just deepens. And I think, even just right from my first book, I think that was the thing that made me confident enough to launch into the water, as it were. And for Tiller and Pong too, I mean, very different voices, as you know. Tiller is, you know, pretty wide ranging in his, you know, the things he draws on, you know, his melodies, if it, as it were are also varied, you know, depending on what he's thinking about. And I had a lot of fun with him. I felt like he was pretty wild and woolly, and he could really go anywhere he wanted. And his lyric, as it were, was something that, you know, really made me feel like I could just, you know, do whatever I wanted. With Pong, it's a little different. You know, he's a little bit more circumspect. Um, there's a more mourning voice to him, a little bit. And, you know, I mean, and mourning, like mourning a death or mourning the past. And so that was fun too, because, you know, it gave me a way to, you know, go into a different gear and go into a different consciousness. So that's kind of how and your last question, or one of your questions, was, you know, how am I sure about it, and, you know, or feel like this is the one I want. I did mention about sustaining the story and sustaining my interest, but uh, you know, it just also has to, you know, have that kind of, I don't know, just right from the start, a little bit of a pop to it, and feel like it's distinctive enough. Like I hadn't quite heard that voice before, and maybe that's it. If it, you know, I mean, not that you know, voices are distinctive, but just, it doesn't have to be wildly distinctive, but just something that felt like, okay, this is this person and only this person. So maybe that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even from the outset, I mean, and I'm someone who's come off of a year in which it's been very difficult to read for extended periods of time. Tiller's voice felt immediate, and it felt familiar, but it also felt like the source of so much possibility. Like it felt like he could say anything and he could draw from anywhere, but I believed him, and I believed him over the course of the text. And it just felt like such a special thing to have a character that you can quite literally follow from one end of the earth to the other, and just sort of trust that you know that their voice can take you there. You know, it was really amazing as a read to experience. I mean, I think that something that, just thinking of the differences between and the similarities between Pong's and Tiller's voices, their relationship was something that was also deeply striking to me and deeply moving, but also deeply surprising, because in some ways it's that of a mentor and a mentee, because Tiller isn't suppose like the strict by the strict definition of the word, he isn't an orphan, but he's very lonely.
Mm,
It seems someone who is looking for a way to just navigate this
yeah,
loneliness
yeah,
when we first find him. And Pong is someone who is of the world and has changed by way of just throwing himself at the world and having the world also throw itself back at him. So there's this mentorship, which is always a really interesting thing to see in a text, but also there's a layer of friendship. And perhaps more for me surprising is that there's a love there, and it is a sort of love that you just don't see in fiction very often, and then it's a love that felt as if though it wouldn't diminish, right? Like there was like I feel like a trick of the book for me at least is that I was always on the edge of my seat wondering when Pong would pull the rug out from Tiller at some point, or Tiller would do the same when one would betray the other, and any number of things happen. But to see that sort of relationship be dynamic and not falter for the duration of the book didn't and doesn't feel like the sort of relationship that I've read before. So I'm wondering if you knew that would be the case from the outset, and what that relationship looks like to you. Did it feel as if though it were a dynamic sort of love, a dynamic sort of business relationship in other ways? And what made you want to write that on the page?
yeah, yeah. That I did. One of the things that started me out in the novel was the idea that Pong was, he's the inspiration for Tiller to come out of his shell, to do something, to get moving, right? So there's just initially that, but of course I knew that it was going to get deeper than that. That there are obviously, as you said, the mentor-mentee relationship, which I have always really cherished in my life. I mean, the inscription, the dedication in this book is to my teachers, and there's so and I could easily name 10 teachers, including some librarians, that saved my life, multiple times at different points in my life.
Yeah.
Right? Right? And that I do have love for, absolute love for, regardless of what they'd ever say or do to me. Right? And so that was, I think, informing the relationship from the start. And but also, of course, as you suggest, there's this thread of betrayal all throughout the book. Or you think that the specter of it at least hangs over them, and I like that, but I didn't want this to be the typical story where of a confidence man who just uses somebody, and then that's the story, right? Because obviously, as you mentioned, Tiller is somebody who needs confidence. He is an orphan. I mean, he isn't technically, because he still has a dad, but he feels like one, and he wants to latch on. And I think that was a kind of a overriding emotion I had about him at the start, that he's absolutely looking for someone in every field. Like it's Pong at the start. Later in the other half of the story, it's with this woman named Val, but he's looking for someone who will show, teach, expose, introduce everything in the realm to him. Uh, and not because Tiller doesn't know about these things, or he's not capable of doing that himself, but it's just he's a little passive. And for me, that is the nature of his initial spark of really being enraptured by Pong. But I didn't know how deeply their relationship would get, but I knew that it would be close. And it's one of the things that um, surprised me about the book in a way, because I didn't in the end want any bad guys in the book.
Which is a special thing.
Yeah, yeah, it's so easy. I mean, I started feeling like everybody was, and maybe this is just where I am in life, is that everyone's just trying, and maybe they do wrong things, but they're just trying their best, to stay above water. And and because of circumstance, because of just the way, as you suggested, the world can snap back at you. You know, we just don't. It's not just us consuming the world. The world consumes us too. And look how it's done. You know, in the last half year. Um, and sometimes, yeah, we can blame each other, but often, if you dig really deep, circumstance is huge for all of us, right? So, so I kind of wanted to honor that, and kind of maybe maybe preserve that that sense of friendship and love between these two, and as best as I could. Yeah.
Yeah, the role of chance in the novel, like in the midst of what I managed, was just a really daunting methodical process as far as structure is concerned. It feels really palpable. I mean, it feels as if though anything could happen as Taylor and Pong navigate their various business endeavors, as they navigate their own relationship and the folks that they come to meet. And it even feels palpable to me, like in the midst of reading it, in a place where it perhaps wouldn't feel palpable, like the suburb situation of like Stagno,
Mm,
the Taylor ends up with Val and Victor Jr., the sort of found family that they put together with one another. Like they literally find one another in an airport, in the Hong Kong airport, but it feels as if though they really latch on to one another in the midst of that. And I suppose like something that I wondered, like thinking of Taylor's relationship with Victor Jr., with Val, thinking of Taylor's relationship with his own biological father and his relationship with Pong. How did the construct of a found family come into play as far as the text was concerned? And did anything that you may have thought prior to the book as far as like what the limits of like a familial relationship, whether blood or otherwise, did any of that change for you over the course of drafting the book?
mm, mm. Well, well, as I mentioned, you know, Tiller does have a dad, but their relationship is loving, but maybe not demonstrably so. you know,
Yeah, yeah.
they love
He's
each other.
there.
They're fine, right? It's going right, and but it's kind of it's comfortable, and maybe too much so, at a certain kind of remove. And so, and of course, Tiller is someone who's lost his mother, has quote unquote disappeared early on in his life, and he's not really going there either. So I definitely felt as if the structure of family in the novel, not just for Tiller, but also for Pong, which we would find out later about
Mm.
Pong's family life back in China during the Cultural Revolution, and then in his first days in America. I mean, if you think about it, both guys are looking for family. They're both for legal reasons, kind of just survival reasons, but of course, most importantly, for emotional reasons, right? And so I guess that's something that maybe my daughters are now in their early 20s, um, and maybe before that we were just so busy, you know, having family life and moving them forward. But now that they're more established and really adults, it's given me a chance to kind of look back on everything, and see all the troubles we had, and the joys, and just the everyday. And I kept thinking about how hollowed out I would be if I didn't hadn't had that. And that was a way for me to think about both of those characters too. It's not just that, as a writer, you don't it's not necessary. I mean, you can't only write out of your experience. Sometimes you have to write out of, I think, an experience you're afraid of. you know
No,
and
no.
that's maybe, and that still makes it real. That still brings it in, right? It's so you don't have to manufacture it. But if you really think about it, and you think about an experience like that, and then marry that and contrast that with your own life, sometimes that can be a help for the writing. And and so I definitely thought that for this. and maybe that's why there's so much stuff about food in the novel.
Mm.
For me, that has always been, and I clearly I don't, food plays a big role in your life. I know, and you're right.
Yeah.
I never read anything by someone who's not Korean about sundubu and pajeon and hot
Uh,
dog and and I mean, you and I have to like make a kamjatan together. I tell you.
one day, when it's safer, one day it'll happen. I mean, it just like on the like thinking of food, like in your work more generally. I think there's something I should say is that right now, like from time to time, I write about food from the New Yorker, but I absolutely would not be doing that if I hadn't read a piece that you wrote called Sea Urchin a very long time ago for the New
Yeah, a long
Yorker.
time ago.
And that, yeah, there's literally a line where you're describing this dish. You say it tastes the way flesh would taste if flesh were a mineral. And like the first time I read that, I just remember thinking like, what the fuck? Like I didn't even know that was I didn't know that was like a thing you could do in language. It felt like synapses connecting and everything else. So thank you for writing that. Like probably that's a very very personal thing. But as a thing of the way that food works in my year abroad, I suppose like the first question of like a two-part thing is I wonder like how your sense of what food can do on the page has changed over the course of your writing tenure, if it has changed. And I think that like a lot has already been made of the role and the presence of food in the text as far as like themes are concerned, as far as narratives concerned, as far as language and descriptions and comparisons are concerned. But as visceral as food is, the novel itself, like it's a very sensory novel. It felt as if though it was one that demands a good deal of each of your senses over the course of the book. And just thinking of how pleasure comes into play in that regard. I wonder how you thought pleasure operated within the novel and if it changed over the course of the book. Like there's that line like a quantum of sweetness. Like as soon as I read it, it was one that stuck with me, like this sort of mantra by which Pong lives to some extent. But also as much as pleasure felt like a factor, just as large, if not one that is larger, it felt as if though the limits of pleasure and also the dangers of pleasure, and in some ways the dangers of the world, felt just as important, particularly for a character like Tiller, who he's aimless in a lot of ways and he's impressionable in a lot of ways, and that just feels like a boon for him as far as experiencing the world is concerned. Like he comes away from all of these experiences, he sees all of these things. He's a sponge in so many different ways, but it also feels deeply dangerous, his impressionability, in the midst of so much excess that is really expanding and challenging and in some ways literally destroying so many of his senses. So I wonder like how your sense of food has changed over the course of your writing tenure that brought you to write about food and around food the way you do in this particular book. And also if the question of the limits of pleasure, the limits of what a body can take and where excess ultimately can lead someone, if those were questions that you were thinking through as you were writing the book.
Absolutely, they were. I'd always used food, and I want to separate the stuff that the nonfiction stuff that I wrote for the New Yorker, which is just, about family and about, my sense of, um, it's a way of connecting to memories and to real people, like the sea urchin and say, my roots in Korea, or in, certain novels like Native Speaker. There's a way that the food does bring together certain characters where they can maybe let their hair down a little bit, maybe put down their shields and end up little bit more vulnerable so they can connect. But in this novel, you mentioned the word, the kind of limits of it and the extremes of it, and this is definitely a book that I really thought from the beginning I wanted to be a visceral experience, a literally sensational experience,
Mhm.
whereas all about the reader through the characters experiencing the whatness of of and the nerve of all that sensation. And as you mentioned, and as you I think very rightly say, about the pleasures, about the pains, and about the limits of those things that are really about, ultimately, this, what it brings up a question of what is this spark of life, what is the spark of vitality that we get, say, from food or sex or or whatever. And that for me is the way that the food works into it. It's not, I don't really care about the palatal issues. I, I mean, not for the book. I care myself. I care myself, of course.
Yeah.
But even myself, when I'm sitting around with friends I love or family, and we're just really enjoying something, we'll just go, oh, damn it, this is so freaking good. But it's also about, but it's not about the flavor at that moment, right? It's about, like, gosh, we're sharing this, and look how alive we are. Look how we're enjoying this moment of cellular stimulation.
Yeah.
And maybe I go back to, in the philosophical sense, an Epicurean idea about it, which is, an idea that we are made of atoms. We are made of cells that just have to take in the world. And food's one of those things. Drink, other bodies, the weather, and these things are just there, and they're undeniable. And I guess that's what I was interested in, Tiller, exploring the world that way. But also, of course, what inevitably happens with human beings is that they overreach in their in their
Too much.
yeah, overreach in their grasping for these, and, taking in these pleasures and taking in these sensations, and then make, and kind of go crazy with ideas about, say, how to extend life, or how to live how to live more richly, or um, how to live more intensely. And the book, I think, explores that too, by introducing some pretty extreme scenes, at Tiller's expense, often. Poor
He
Tiller.
learns though. He learns. I mean, it's. I just thinking of the whether it's making curry, whether one very particular sense, whether it is in a sexual sense, whether it is in the act of simply opening oneself up to karaoke, right? And like discovering there's a sense of discovery from experience to experience to experience. And what felt very much to me, the novel, it feels as if it was written by someone who loves story, right? Which one would like hope would be like an implicit assumption, when you read a book. But that's not always the case. Everyone like has stories for how they are where they are, whether that is a story involving their family, or thinking of Pong and his parents in the midst of the Cultural Revolution, whether it's a story of geography as folks move from one point to another, whether that's a story of association and context just by thinking of neighbors, thinking of business associates that are, even if they're only in the novel for a brief period of time, like it is so much a book that feels as if though it itself is in love with stories. Like it didn't. I suppose that's what I think of when I can't help but shake this idea that it's so much a book of the world and the many different stories that it can contain. And I suppose that the question that's like hiding in all of that is, when you began the novel, did you know that it would be one that is so centered, it feels, on the act of becoming, right? On the act, like the dynamic act of movement, whether just as a person, whether it's Taylor, whether it's Pong, whether it's Val, whether it's Victor Jr. And do you think that it would be a book of so many stories, with so many different stories intertwined? Because so many things are happening, many of them happening simultaneously, and yet they're all moving in tandem with one another. It feels very much like you're watching a juggling act or like a balancing act, and any number of details and obstacles are thrown at the person who's doing the juggling, and it just goes on and on and on, and it makes a sort of sense, right? Like it always felt natural, you know, by way of both of the voices, and then everything falls into place. So I wonder, like, I suppose, what was the process of writing the novel, maybe more generally? And did you have a sense of how many stories and what kinds of stories and how the stories about becoming would change as you wrote it?
Well, I knew that given where they were starting, which is, you know, a really kind of controlled environment of this nice suburb of Dunbar, and I knew that everything that they would find outside of that would just, you know, widen like this exponentially, and that I wanted that to happen. The problem with that was that I started getting kind of freaked out and scared, thinking, okay, I don't want to write 1,000-page novel. Nobody wants to read 1,000-page novel.
I would read it. I would absolutely read it.
I mean, it's already a 500-page novel practically. But the second point of that too is, okay, yeah, I knew I was gonna have fun, you know, and make it very eventful. Time, place, have everything going on at once, and, you know, as you say, kind of juggling everything once, and throwing these things up in the air high enough that they would just kind of stay there while I was putting other stuff there, and that at some point you had everything in the air, right? And then you're just adding balls, you know.
Yeah.
Um, but but the but the but the trick about that is, and again, which I started getting a little scared about, maybe 2/3 of the way through, is like, how the fuck am I going to
I
capture
didn't
all
know
this?
as the reader, I was just like, I kept wondering, like, this is incredible, but he can't pull this off, and then you do, and it is so satisfying
Yeah.
at the end.
And that's the part that I started really grinding on and thinking about 2/3 of the way in. And this is, you know, this is the problem with it. I don't know if other novelists have this problem. This is my problem, which is I'm so excited at the beginning. In the middle, I think, okay, I'm just going to throw everything I have at it, everything that I know, every everything that I am at this moment. But then, like 2/3, 3/4 way, and I was like, oh my goodness, I can't do it. I just can't. I just can't do it. I just don't have whatever. And but somehow I think, you know, somehow it works out. It tends to work out because, and maybe the only reason it works out is not because I'm so smart and I can see how everything fits together, but, you know, it's all of a piece maybe, and it's all of a piece in terms of Tiller's character, and all the things that he needs, and it's Pong's character and all the things that he wants. So it's, and maybe if I'm still focused on those two basic questions in every scene, maybe they all fit together, you know, and maybe they make some kind of sense. Because you certainly don't want to engineer it so it's like so, like such a contraption, and then it feels like, oh, of course, you know, you want it to be a surprise, like life, right? You want it to kind of fall in a mess, and maybe it's a mess, but it kind of looks like it makes sense, you know. And so I guess that's how I that was part of the process, I guess. I mean, that's a description of the process. And you know, it's not a pretty process. It's-
But the end result, you know, it's beautiful, just as a text, just like as a narrative. And I suppose, like, the last question that I'll ask before we move over to the Q&A is, like, at the beginning, you mentioned that one of the things that it just feels like a necessity in the midst of writing a project, or at the very outset of the project, is having these questions and having these ideas that you feel will sustain the length of just actually doing the thing, like just sustaining the duration of what you just described, like a really demanding process. And there is a question that is asked in the book, midway through. What happens to you when you've gone way too far? And once it was asked, it was one that stayed with me, particularly with everything that followed. So I suppose the last question I'll ask on my end is, what did you find the answer to that in the midst of writing the book, and did it change for you in the midst of writing it?
Yeah, I when I wrote that line, I remember, it's after like a really, weird scene. I won't give it away, but but it's a scene that surprised me, that I wrote it, and I was kind of glad that my mother isn't alive, that so she doesn't have to read that scene. But that's the only reason why I'm glad my mother isn't alive. Otherwise, I'd trade the world. Um, uh, but after I wrote that, maybe that's a pivotal point because that's when things escalate to a place where it's no longer kind of realism, but maybe some other kind of bizarre, absurdist level that is real to Tiller, but intellectually just freaks him out. And 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 in some ways, I think it's kind of like a certain kind of like clearing the buffer where it's just like he's and I think this is what happens sometimes. You're reduced to almost an emptiness again. You think you're gathering all these experiences, but when you go too far, you have to reset and you like think, okay, what do I believe in now? What are my values now?
Oh,
What why am I here, and what's gonna now, because it's kind of changed all of your no the notations to self that you kind of held on to and used to make your way in the world. And and when something like that happens, but in this case, kind of antic, but sometimes very real in most cases, then what's your foundation? Where do you start? And I guess that's where I was thinking. It's like, well, I wanted to get him to that place again, where in some sense the book starts again, um and that he's like on this level now.
basically.
Right. And that escalation, I think, allows that the book to go to another level later on, so that it doesn't seem like totally outlandish, even though the jumps are. It feels more normal, even though they aren't. And I kind of like that idea. It's the super normal, the extra normal, because that's who we sometimes have to be. And maybe that's and not in a great way, in an incredibly competent way, but just a new person, a new self. And that's something that I hope to see Tiller have to experience.
It's an extraordinary thing to get to see and to get to read. Suppose we'll at this point try and make our way through a handful of audience questions. The first one is from Eunice, and they ask, did you write My Year Abroad after you moved to the West Coast, or had you already started it? Curious how your relocation has affected your perspective, writing interests, and potentially the final products that you end up
That's a great question. Yes, I did start it out here. I remember writing. It was my sabbatical year, and I was just between, taking a new job at Stanford. I'm an East Coast guy. I grew up in New York and taught at Princeton for many years, very happily. But was feeling as if, at that point in my life and life of my family, maybe looking for a change. And Eunice, I was absolutely definitely thinking that I would like to be more on the West Coast because it's a different vibe, especially for someone who's Asian American. Um, and being a tri-state area and Asian American is very different from, say, being an Asian American grows up in Orange County, right, or LA or San Francisco. And I like it out here for lots of reasons, but also because I felt like I was, and maybe this is reflected in the book. Tiller is 1/8 Asian, um, and he in the book, of course, he passes as white and he's seen as white, but through the course of the book, he more and more kind of identifies and thinks of himself not as Asian, but just he's definitely Asian curious, as I've been saying, and and he's like, you know, he doesn't know where he's going to end up, but that's the way he's going, and you know, in terms of his intellection and his and emotion, and I guess, you know, I've, even though I'm 55 years old and you think that I would have all these issues sorted out, I think I'm still moving towards Asia more and more as I get older, and I think that helped me write the book. Absolutely, I'm not sure I could have written this book um, back east. You know, and being on the West Coast too, you know, it's easier to travel to Asia, and so it's all going kind of a piece, I guess.
Brilliant. Yeah. Next question is from Daniel, and they say that they're currently a student taking a course on Asian American literature and history. One concept that they've been discussing is the writing style of show don't tell with regard to ethically writing Asian and Asian American narratives in a non-performative, non-operatic way. So Daniel asks, what is your relationship with show don't tell? Is that a style of writing that you teach? And how do you approach writing about Asian American identity and exploring the interiority of Asian American experiences?
Well, you know, that's the old saw, right? Show don't tell. But as I tell my students, show is very important. You know, you have to show us the world, and you have to show us, most importantly, not the world, but the world as someone is seeing it and feeling it and taking it in. That's what you're really showing. But as a lot of great writers do, they show and show and show, and then they can also tell a lot too. They can just sit you down after they've shown you a sense of that person's consciousness, that the way that that psyche is engaging with whatever context they're in, whatever players they're in there. Um, Once we feel comfortable enough, then I think all the telling can come. So I've never told my students, my own students, and many of whom are Asian American, uh, only show. I do say you have to show a lot, but once you've gained our trust, once you've grounded us, then I think sometimes you do have to tell, because you know you do have to testify in a way sometimes. And I don't know if that's for Asian Americans or other people on the margins, or you know, not non-mainstream white people, but sometimes it feels like you do have to, you know, just explain things sometimes, because you know, explain them to yourself, explain them to someone who doesn't know, explain them. We're trying to change the culture so that we, you know, we, I think, as particularly as Asian Americans, we've been living in a context that's not our own, you know, and that we're trying to change so that it becomes more of our own. And this is one of the things that, um, you know, we do that through arts, literature, film, all those kinds of things, business too. And part of that, I think, you know, the prerogative of the writer should be, yes, I'm going to do the work that every other writer does, but sometimes you do have to, you know, lay it out, and so that's what I would say.
Right. Yeah, I suppose the second to last question on this front is actually a combination of a handful of questions, but what it largely comes down to is how, from book to book, from work to work, you have sometimes radically departed from the style, from the themes, from the ideas in some ways of the prior text. So, how do you know when to do that? Is that a conscious decision that you begin a new text with? And has it ever surprised you? Has a new text ever taken you someplace that you did not think that you would ever be able to go?
Mm-hmm. Well, for example, you know, my last novel was On Such a Full Sea, and for those of you who have not read it, it's a book that's, you know, all about a certain controlled environment. You know, like I would say that one of the overriding motifs of that book is the sense of a controlled community, almost a curated community, um, and and as such, the voice of that book, and we're going back to your first question, Brian, about voice, and I guess the spirit of a book. the soul of the book, was one that was very controlled, really circumspect and careful. Wondering, of course, but just the aesthetic feel of that book is so much about a certain kind of cloister, and I think so. It wasn't a conscious choice to absolutely just want to blow up the cloister and go out into the world, but I think that's just my need as a writer, my need as a person, because as as we all know as writers, especially novelists, you spend so much time and you invest so much of yourself in a project, and you live that project, and after it's done, you don't want to live the same project, in at least I don't, in any way, shape, or form. I need a completely different gear. I need different music, as we were saying from the start. I need all these different rhythms, and just because I'm bored, but also I just can't stand myself. I don't want to do that again. So in some ways, every book of mine has been in some ways an aesthetic response to the last one, and not so intentional, but really, just what I needed as a person and as an artist.
Right. Yeah. And the last question that we'll end the event on is a question that is dear to my heart, just from Eric. And Eric asks, what is your desert island dish? What is your last meal on Earth? Arguably two different questions, but
Yeah,
very
really.
important.
My
Crucial
last
even.
Well, of course, I'm sure you talk about this all the time with your loved ones, Brian. But
Oh, yeah.
my children and I, and my wife, we argue about it all the time. My wife is from an Italian American Belgian tradition, and of course, my kids are half Korean, half European, and it turns out from their 23andMe, I'm like 100% Korean. I didn't think that. I was like shocked, but I'm 100% Korean. So we always say, okay, there are two things. It's kimchi jjigae or linguine and clams. Linguine with clams. They're completely different dishes, but of course, in texture and tradition and flavors. But in some ways, I couldn't live without either. So it's hard. It's hard. I don't know. Maybe you can think of, Brian. You can write a New Yorker column about how to combine them.
Impossible. Impossible. Yeah, I mean, even for desert island dish, I'm thinking like, what is that for me? Like, so I'm glad I don't.
What would it be for you? I'm curious. Because
Well,
I love your column, so I want to. Your pancake one was fantastic, because I was never a pancake eater, but after meeting Edna Lewis and started making her pancakes, boy, are they so good. But anyway, I'm curious. Is like what's yours?
since you're putting me on the spot, for my desert island dish, I'd probably say Jamaican rice and peas, because you would just survive. Like if longevity is the goal, like I would just
Oh, so
survive
that's a
off of that
practical.
dish. That's a practical dish. But the last meal on Earth would easily be kimchi jjigae. Like that just clears every other meal.
No way,
But then I
really?
just, yeah, if I
You are
had
the
my
best.
last bite and I just dropped dead, like it'd be sad, I guess, but I'd be quite happy. I
That's
know.
great.
On that abundantly positive note, thank you, Chang-rae, so much for taking the time with us this evening. It means such a good deal to have your writing, to have this book. If he hasn't purchased My Year Abroad yet, please do that. It's the loveliest novel, and just really grateful that you've taken the time to talk to us about it.
Well, thanks so much, Brian. It's fantastic talking to you. And I'm telling you, after all this crap ends, we got to get together.
Yeah, hopefully. It's gonna
You're in
happen.
Houston, right? You're in Houston.
I am still in Houston, yeah.
Yeah, great eating town, by the way. So I love it there.
Loveliest. Yeah.
Okay, you
Thank
got
you.
it.
Thank you so much. Just very quickly, a couple of closing notes. My name is Lily Philpott. I'm the programs manager at AAWW. I want to thank Chang-rae and Brian again for such an incredible conversation. I love that you ended on this question, and now I'm incredibly hungry to eat dinner. But thank you both. We're really so grateful that you joined us. I just wanted to note quickly for our audience, this Saturday at 12 p.m. Eastern, we are going to host a talk with Mira Jacob and Nikesh Shukla to discuss Nikesh's new memoir, Brown Baby. You can RSVP for that at aaw.org/events. I want to note that this event was recorded. It will be on our YouTube channel along with an archive of our other events. It'll be on our podcast, AAWW Radio. I hope you will listen, share, return to the conversation. And what we're going to do now is actually keep the Zoom open for a few minutes. We'll put some more slides on screen. The AAWW staff will be in the chat if anyone has further questions, anything they want to ask about AAWW. But we hope you will kind of hang around for a moment as if this was an event in person, and we do look forward to gathering with everybody in our space in New York City in future. So thank you both again. This was so wonderful. We're so grateful. And have a good night. Thank you.
Hey, Bryan, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can still hear you. Hey, Chang-rae.
Hey, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, man. It was great to meet
Oh,
you.
wow.
Great to talk. Hey, do you teach there or you just live there?
Yeah, so right now I'm teaching at Rice, and it's really cool. I mean, the faculty is great, students are great. So but
You're
I'm
teaching
there until
wait,
at Rice.
hear that? At Rice. Oh, excellent.
Yeah, I'm here until I'm on contract until I suppose the end of next spring. So,
Right.
but it's been really great. I mean, they've been just really lovely.
Oh, cool. Is it the MFA program? Do they have an MFA program? It's just undergrad.
No,
Just undergrad.
it's just undergrad. Yeah,
Right.
it's just undergrad. But they're really most of the students aren't writing track or like on the creative writing track, but it's really lovely because we can just read everything and no one really has any objections or like preconceived notions of anything. So it's been a really nice time so far.
Oh, cool. Yeah, Rice is great. I did a talk there, and
Cool.
I know that the dean. Well, she's not the dean of architecture anymore. I guess she went to Harvard, but
And you're at Stanford right now.
Yeah.
Or you're on sabbatical.
I'm on sabbatical right now.
Okay.
Yeah. But from Stanford. But kind of a bad year to be on sabbatical because normally I'd be traveling a lot.
Yeah, you can't really go anywhere. Yeah, you can't go anywhere right now.
No, so it's been kind of unfortunate. But I wanted to tell you though about a formative formative experience was with jerk chicken. It was
really
yeah. Kind of blew my mind actually. It was on spring break in college. We didn't have any money and we wanted to go to Jamaica, and going to like the touristy parts of Jamaica were just too expensive. So we found this is 1,000 years ago. It was before Airbnb. Somehow someone found near Port Antonio, just this shack on the beach, and it was so cheap. For the whole week it was like $250 or something like that. And so 4 of us went there, 2 couples, and right around the corner from it was this shack where this guy was just making jerk chicken. And I don't know, obviously it was a popular place, but whenever I went there nobody was there because he was making so many chickens. So I said maybe I just went at the wrong time. But he had all these chickens, but then also in the back he had all this ganja drying.
Yes, that is very.
It was like one of these situations where I thought, oh well, I'm gonna try both. And his jerk chicken was incredible, explosive. I've never had something so smoky, so spicy, so intensely herbed. And then his herb was the strongest stuff that I'd ever had. And the 2 of the things that just blew my mind. I just couldn't believe it.
That is, yeah, that's and things are still very much that way. I mean, if you're willing to forgo a lot of the resort trappings,
Montego Bay business, right?
Yeah, quite a cheap trip to Jamaica and just eat really good food. I mean,
it's amazing.
I haven't been in some time, but I hope to when things settle down, well, when and if things settle down, I hope to be able to spend a
Me
little bit
too.
more time there.
So I want to tell you that.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm gonna take that. Oh, thank you.
I think we're gonna close down the Zoom in just a moment. I wanted to draw your attention to the chat, which is calling for a cooking show and a food traveling show between the two of you.
We should do that.
One day. One day, if someone has funding for it. Yeah.
Okay, for sure, man. Okay, well, I'll say goodbye then, and be
Likewise.
well, and see you on the other side.
Thanks so much, Chang-rae. Yeah,
Okay.
please take care over the next few
Thanks,
weeks. Yeah. Thank you, Lily. Thank you, Lily.
Okay,
Thank
bye.
you so much. Wonderful.